The privilege of a lifetime is to become who you truly are. You might have noticed something unsettling happening in your relationships lately. The more you grow, the more you understand yourself, the stranger and more intense the reactions around you become, particularly from those people who once seemed to have an invisible hold over your emotions, your decisions, your very sense of self. People who, without you even realizing it, kept you small, kept you dependent, kept you questioning your own reality. What you're experiencing isn't coincidence. It's one of the most profound psychological phenomena that Carl Jung ever explored. When you begin to outgrow a narcissistic dynamic, when you start reclaiming your psychological independence, something inevitable happens. The narcissist doesn't just notice. They react. And they react in ways that can feel completely bewildering, even devastating if you don't understand what's really happening beneath the surface. Carl Jung, the pioneering Swiss psychiatrist who founded analytical psychology, spent decades studying the intricate workings of the human psyche. He understood something most people never grasp about toxic relationships, particularly those involving narcissistic dynamics. The problem isn't just the narcissist's behavior. The real issue lies in understanding why certain people become trapped in these patterns, while others seem naturally immune to them. Today, we're going to dive deep into Jung's insights about what happens when you begin to break free from narcissistic control. But more importantly, we're going to understand why this process is so painful, why the reactions can be so extreme, and how your journey towards psychological wholeness threatens everything the narcissist has built their identity around. The truth Jung discovered is both liberating and sobering. When you start to individuate, when you begin to become truly yourself rather than the person others need you to be, you're not just changing your life, you're dismantling an entire psychological ecosystem that someone else has been using to maintain their sense of self. And they will fight to preserve it, often in ways that can leave you questioning your own sanity. Understanding narcissism through Jung's lens requires us to look beyond surface behaviors and into the deeper psychological structures that drive them. Jung built on Freud's work but took it much further, exploring what he called the libido not just as sexual energy, but as the fundamental life force that drives all human psychological activity. In healthy development, this psychic energy flows naturally between ourselves and the world around us. We invest energy in relationships, in creative pursuits, in personal growth. But in narcissistic dynamics, something crucial goes wrong. The narcissist becomes trapped in what Jung called excessive ego libido investment. Almost all their psychic energy becomes focused inward on maintaining and protecting an inflated self-image. This creates what Jung identified as a primitive form of psychological development. The narcissist remains stuck in what he called infantile patterns, unable to genuinely invest emotional energy in others, except as extensions of themselves. They see other people not as separate individuals with their own needs, rights, and realities, but as objects that exist to reflect back their own magnificence. Jung also explored the concept of the persona and the shadow. The narcissist constructs an elaborate persona, a social mask designed to elicit constant admiration and validation. This mask becomes so central to their identity that they lose touch with any authentic sense of self underneath it. Meanwhile, all their unacceptable traits, their flaws, their human vulnerabilities get pushed into what Jung called the shadow, the unconscious part of the personality that contains everything we refuse to acknowledge about ourselves. Here's where it gets particularly insidious. Because the narcissist can't tolerate their own shadow material, they constantly project it onto others. Their failures become your fault. Their insecurities become your problems to solve. Their rage becomes something you caused. You become a repository for everything they can't bear to see in themselves. But here's what makes Jung's understanding so powerful. He recognized that these dynamics don't exist in a vacuum. For a narcissistic system to function, it requires what we might call a psychological partner, someone who unconsciously agrees to carry the projections, to absorb the displaced emotions, to maintain the careful balance that keeps the narcissist's fragile ego intact. This is why breaking free isn't just a matter of deciding to leave or setting boundaries. You're not just dealing with external pressure. You're dealing with deeply ingrained psychological patterns within yourself that made the dynamic possible in the first place. Jung understood that real liberation requires what he called individuation, the process of becoming psychologically whole and autonomous. When you begin this journey of outgrowing a narcissistic dynamic, you're essentially embarking on what Jung considered the central task of human psychological development. You're moving from a state of unconscious dependency to conscious autonomy. You're learning to differentiate between your authentic self and the roles others have assigned to you. This process involves what Jung called withdrawing your projections. You stop seeing the narcissist as the powerful, intimidating figure they presented themselves as. You begin to see them as they really are, often a deeply wounded person trapped in primitive psychological patterns. You stop taking responsibility for their emotions, their reactions, their problems. But perhaps most importantly, you begin to reclaim your own psychic energy. Instead of constantly directing your attention toward managing their moods, predicting their reactions, trying to keep them satisfied, you redirect that energy toward your own growth, your own needs, your own authentic expression. Jung understood that this redirection of libido, this reclaiming of your own psychological energy, is fundamentally transformative. It's not just about feeling better or having healthier relationships. It's about becoming who you actually are beneath all the adaptations you've made to survive in toxic systems. This transformation involves confronting your own unconscious patterns. You have to face the parts of yourself that became complicit in the dynamic. Maybe you have a deep need to be needed. Maybe you're terrified of conflict or abandonment. Maybe you've been unconsciously trying to earn love by being useful, accommodating, or perpetually understanding. Jung called this process of facing your unconscious material essential for psychological maturation. He said that until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life, and you will call it fate. Breaking free from narcissistic dynamics requires making conscious all the unconscious needs and fears that made you vulnerable to these patterns in the first place. When you truly begin to individuate, when you start to withdraw your energy from the narcissistic system and redirect it toward your own authentic development, something predictable happens. The narcissist doesn't just notice, they panic. From their perspective, you're not just changing, you're threatening their entire psychological survival system. Remember, their sense of self depends on having others reflect back their grandiose self-image. They need you to remain in the role they've assigned you. They need you to continue carrying their projections, absorbing their disowned emotions, providing the constant validation that keeps their inflated ego intact. Jung's concept of enantiodromia becomes crucial here. This principle suggests that when any psychological process reaches an extreme, it tends to convert into its opposite. While this usually refers to internal psychological processes, we can see it manifesting in the narcissist's external behavior when they lose control of their psychological environment. When you withdraw your energy, when you stop playing your assigned role, the narcissist experiences what Jung would call a damming up of psychic energy. They lose their primary source of narcissistic supply. Their external validation system begins to crumble. And this creates intense internal pressure that has to find expression somehow. The reactions you'll see can vary dramatically, but they follow predictable patterns that Jung's work helps us understand. Some narcissists respond with complete indifference or rejection. If they can't control you, they simply discard you, often with a coldness that can feel shocking after years of intense connection. This isn't because they've suddenly stopped caring. It's because acknowledging that you have autonomous existence outside their control threatens their entire psychological framework. Others intensify their manipulation efforts. They might love bomb you, trying to recreate the early intensity that originally drew you in. They might make promises to change, engage in dramatic gestures, or create crises that seem to require your involvement. From a Jungian perspective, this represents their unconscious attempt to re-establish the psychological dynamic that was feeding their ego. Perhaps most destructively, many narcissists respond by aggressively projecting their shadow material onto you. As their internal psychological pressure builds, they need somewhere to discharge the anxiety, rage, and shame they can't consciously tolerate. You become the target for everything they refuse to acknowledge about themselves. They might accuse you of being selfish, manipulative, or cruel, projecting onto you exactly the behaviors they themselves have been exhibiting. In extreme cases, some narcissists experience what Jung might recognize as a psychological breakdown when their external supply system collapses. Without the constant external validation to maintain their inflated self-image, unconscious material can break through into consciousness in overwhelming ways. This can manifest as rage attacks, paranoid thinking, or desperate attempts to regain control through increasingly erratic behavior. Jung understood that these reactions, while painful to witness and experience, represent the narcissist's unconscious recognition that their psychological survival system is under threat. They're not consciously choosing to be cruel or manipulative. They're unconsciously defending against what feels like psychological annihilation. But here's what Jung would want you to understand. These reactions, no matter how intense or disturbing, are not your responsibility to manage. They're not evidence that you're doing something wrong. They're actually confirmation that you're doing something profoundly right. You're reclaiming your psychological autonomy, and that naturally threatens any relationship dynamic based on your dependence and compliance. The narcissist's reaction is fundamentally about their own internal psychological crisis. It's not really about you, even though it's directed at you. Jung emphasized that each person must take responsibility for their own psychological development. You cannot and should not try to manage another person's shadow material or maintain their psychological equilibrium at the expense of your own growth. Understanding this from a Jungian perspective can be both liberating and sobering. Liberating because it helps you see that their reactions aren't really about your worth or your choices. Sobering because it clarifies that there's often no way to maintain the relationship while continuing your own psychological development. The dynamic itself was built on patterns that your growth naturally dismantles. As you continue this journey of psychological individuation, Jung's insights point toward a path that goes far beyond simply escaping toxicity. This is about embracing what he called the fundamental task of human development, becoming who you authentically are rather than who others need you to be. Continued individuation means refusing to abandon this process, even when it's uncomfortable, even when others react negatively, even when you feel temporarily alone or misunderstood. Jung saw this as a moral imperative, not just a psychological goal. He believed that becoming authentic was each person's responsibility, not just to themselves, but to the collective human consciousness. This ongoing work involves what Jung called integration and self-reflection. You have to continually examine your own motivations, your own projections, your own unconscious patterns. The goal isn't to become perfect or to never make mistakes. The goal is to become conscious of your own psychological processes so that you're making choices from awareness rather than from unconscious compulsion. Setting boundaries becomes not just a practical skill, but a psychological necessity. From Jung's perspective, healthy boundaries aren't walls you build to keep others out. They're expressions of your authentic self, clear statements about who you are and what you will and won't accept. When you know yourself deeply, boundaries become natural expressions of that self-knowledge rather than defensive reactions to others' behavior. Jung emphasized what he called the moral factor in psychological development. This isn't about conventional morality or social expectations. It's about the deep ethical commitment to your own authentic development. It means being willing to disappoint others rather than betray yourself. It means accepting responsibility for your own psychological well-being rather than expecting others to manage it for you. Perhaps most importantly, Jung taught that individuation requires maintaining what he called a lifeline to your unconscious. This means staying connected to your inner wisdom, your dreams, your intuitive understanding of what's authentic for you. It means not allowing external pressures to disconnect you from your own psychological center. This ongoing process isn't easy. Jung was honest about the difficulties involved in psychological maturation. You'll face periods of loneliness as you distance yourself from relationships based on unconscious patterns. You'll encounter criticism from people who preferred your accommodating, manageable version. You'll have moments of doubt about whether this path is worth the discomfort. But Jung also understood something profound about this journey. The more you individuate, the more you become capable of genuine relationship. When you're not constantly managing others' projections or trying to earn love through compliance, you become free to connect with others from authenticity rather than need. You attract people who appreciate your real self rather than the role you've learned to play. Jung believed that this process of becoming psychologically whole was not just personally liberating, but collectively necessary. Each person who does this work contributes to the overall psychological health of human community. By refusing to participate in unconscious dynamics, by withdrawing your energy from toxic patterns, by becoming genuinely yourself, you're not just healing your own life. You're modeling possibility for others. The ultimate goal isn't to become invulnerable or to never be hurt again. It's to become so grounded in your authentic self that external manipulation loses its power over you. It's to develop what Jung called psychological sovereignty, the ability to remain centered in your own truth regardless of how others react. When you reach this place, the narcissist's attempts to control, manipulate, or destabilize you simply bounce off. Not because you become hard or defensive, but because you become solid. You know who you are, what you want, and what you're willing to accept. You're no longer seeking external validation or approval. So their attempts to withhold or weaponize these things become irrelevant. This is true freedom. Not the absence of challenge or difficulty, but the presence of authentic choice. When you're individuated in Jung's sense, you respond to life from your center rather than reacting from your wounds. You can choose to engage or not engage, to give your energy or to withdraw it, based on what serves your authentic development rather than what manages others' reactions. Outgrowing the narcissistic dynamic is ultimately an act of profound psychological courage. It requires facing your own unconscious patterns, withdrawing your projections, and taking full responsibility for your own psychological well-being. It means choosing growth over comfort, authenticity over approval, psychological freedom over the illusion of safety that comes from remaining small. The narcissist's reaction, however painful or dramatic, is not a reflection of your worth or your choices. It's a reflection of their own psychological limitations, their inability to tolerate your autonomous existence, their unconscious recognition that their control system is crumbling. Jung understood that this process of individuation is not just about personal healing. It's about contributing to the evolution of human consciousness itself. Each person who chooses authenticity over adaptation, who refuses to participate in unconscious psychological dynamics, who does the difficult work of becoming genuinely themselves, creates ripples that extend far beyond their individual life. Your journey of outgrowing narcissistic patterns isn't just about escaping toxicity. It's about answering what Jung saw as life's fundamental call, the call to become who you really are. This process may cost you relationships, opportunities, or the comfort of familiar patterns. But what you gain is immeasurable. The freedom to live from your authentic center, the peace that comes from psychological integrity, and the deep satisfaction of becoming who you were always meant to be. The narcissist's reaction is temporary. Your authentic self is eternal. Choose accordingly.